a response to Fede. You say that we may be going around in circles here, and I think that we may, but it might not actually be that much of a problem, because I've found that in many cases a situation like that results from a fundamental misunderstanding. And to me, the fundamental misunderstanding is what we may be referring to as needs versus desires. Now, I would put it this way. A need is something that we require to reach an equilibrium, to get to a position where we're more or less neutral. We no longer require something. There are no deficits to be met. I don't think that such a position actually exists, but let's say we're dealing with a specific attribute. I am hungry. I need food. Now, that strikes me as how I would use the term need. There is an actual deficit there, at least on the surface. And I would say a desire is, I am hungry, so I desire to go out and eat in a nice restaurant with nice food and nice service and pleasant surroundings with music, and make an event of it. Maybe as part of an overall nice evening out to the movies, coupled with some fun and games in the sack afterwards with wifey. There's difference there between filling in a hole and actually doing something that is an enhancement of a pre-existing equilibrium. You don't just sort of, I make the distinction often between the way that the English allegedly eat and the French allegedly eat. The English put food in their belly to keep themselves satisfied. The French experience the act of eating. You sit down, it's an art. You converse, you eat properly, you discuss the food, you ruminate on the food. One thing you notice about the way the French eat is they're not really all that, they're known for their cuisine, but they're not big eaters. They don't eat a lot, but when they eat carefully. I'll put it that way. Here in Canada, when we eat, we tend to, or we often do tend to overeat. Even though we eat quickly, we eat more. That's the way I see it. It's not so much like, I think that we're unclear that there might be a difference, or we might disagree fundamentally, that there might be a difference between an actual deficit, something that we need to do to meet an equilibrium, and an enhancement, which means that we are making an existing equilibrium that much better. We're actually enjoying ourselves as opposed to just meeting a need. Do these things exist? Well, it comes down to the fundamental idea that what is the, asking yourself, what is the default position? I don't think that we can actually define a default position in terms of equilibrium. I think that we have to sort of state what we feel our own default position is. We can't say the default position is happiness, or the default position is suffering. Or we can't say the default position is a deficit, or the default position is an enhancement. I think that we have to sort of say, we have to examine our own position and say, what are we actually coming to this entire discussion with already in our minds? What is my default position when I'm hungry and I go to a restaurant? Am I going to the restaurant merely to end my hunger? I would say no, I'm not. If I was just trying to end my hunger, I would whip something up quickly and get it into my belly as quickly as possible. There, no more hunger. But if I'm looking for an enhancement, if I want to sort of enjoy the act of meeting a need and push myself into an enhanced position, I go to a restaurant. I go and I listen to nice music, etc., go to a movie, have a romantic hour or so with wifey afterwards. That kind of thing. It becomes an actual experience. You actually plan it. to both meet the requirement of food and enjoy the requirement and enjoy the actual experience of eating. Or, say other things. Say the act of seeing something. I might need to see things in order to avoid dangers or to get things that I want or to get things that I require. But if I just want to go to an art gallery and behold certain things, I'm using my faculty of sight for something beyond merely meeting a deficit. You'd sort of, one could, I suppose, argue that if I'm going there, then I'm meeting a deficit. In other words, I've identified a deficit in myself for the enjoyment of art. But again, I would say that if I have a need in myself for the enjoyment of art, it is actually an enhancement of an equilibrium. I can't imagine a circumstance under which one would actually need to go to an art gallery, unless, of course, it's a need for distraction, a la Zapfi. But let's say everything's fine, and you just decide that, okay, I want to enhance my position, so I'm going to go and enjoy myself at an art gallery. Staring at paintings or at statues or things like this, sculptures, as opposed to simply using my eyes to meet my basic needs for survival. What is your default position here? It's not a question of what is the default position. It's what default are you referring to when you decide whether or not something is a need or a desire, or you need something for an equilibrium, or you desire something for an enhancement. The two are not the same thing. And the type of philosophy that I follow, and I don't think you're interested, but a few people have watched this, is aimed at using one's desires to enhance one's life. We have needs for certain things, but we get other things other than simply meeting the deficit by doing them. Tantra, as I understand it, is using one's needs in such a way as to go beyond a mere equilibrium into an enhanced position. You're not just getting food into your belly as quickly as possible. You want to go beyond just a neutral or sated state. You want to go over into a plus. Now, I suppose one could say that a plus doesn't exist. Okay, maybe to you it doesn't. I hate to say this, but there are those of us who simply, or I assume there are those of us who simply can't imagine what an enhancement is. Okay, I'm sorry if somebody is like that. That doesn't mean that an enhancement doesn't exist just because somebody can't imagine it. It's a nasty thought, of course, and I would feel sorry for anyone who doesn't understand that there are actual positives in existence. And I'm not really sure that anyone can even demonstrate that there are positives to someone. But you can, again, it's not a question of what is the default position for everybody. It's what is the default position for oneself. Now, I'm glad that we're discussing Orwell here. Room 101 in 1984, where Winston Smith is finally and conclusively broken by the party. Where he's met with that which is unendurable. He's met with the ultimate deficit, the ultimate moment of reckoning with that which he cannot endure, a deficit he cannot endure, something that he must obey, that he must push away from himself. The way that he describes it after Winston is falling backwards in his mind, once the rats are pulled away from him and he doesn't have them attacking his face, he's going away from the rats. He's falling backwards, putting millions of miles between himself and the rats. It's a fascinating literary device Orwell uses. And all that he's doing is he's removing a deficit. He's removing an aversion. He's removing something that he doesn't want to happen. but he has been fundamentally changed at that moment. He's been broken by that which he was finally faced, held by the hair, as it were, and forced to face something he cannot face. He was broken by that. That's a literary device, but I certainly believe it's possible that people can be broken. Can the reverse happen? Can you have an experience that is so profoundly positive that you're now in a position where nothing, as it were, can touch you? Nothing can cause you to break, that you are more or less, in a sense, indestructible. And I mean broken in the sense that Winston was broken, and by being enhanced to the point where you cannot be even put to an equilibrium, you're so high above equilibrium by an experience that alters you in the same way that Room 101 altered Winston. Let's say we have Room 100 right across the corridor from Room 101, where the worst thing in the world doesn't happen, the best thing in the world happens. Is such a thing possible? And I can't see how we would argue that it isn't possible. You say that it's an intuition that it isn't possible, but okay, that's an interesting thing. It says, I would assume that says more about what you already have in your mind before you begin to discuss this than an actual empirical truth out there. I would hold that if there are sort of the opposite of peak experiences, like we would call, I guess, if we're going to talk about peaks and valleys, Winston had a valley experience. He had the sort of nadir experience. You can't get any lower than that, or more horrific or more negative than Room 101. If we allow for that, I think it automatically sort of says that we have to examine the possibility that a peak experience is also possible that would do the same thing as a nadir-like experience, but in reverse. Room 100, I guess, across the hall from Room 101, would present you with the best thing in the world, and it would fundamentally change you just as fundamentally as Room 101 would. Logically, that seems to be unarguable, but I'm open to be corrected. It's interesting, though, this idea of enhancement. Do enhancements exist, or are enhancements possible? I'll put it that way.